Hello everyone, this is Brian Ka with another video to help you pass the California bar exam and the baby bar exam. So in this episode, we're gonna write another essay for property law. This one seems a little bit difficult because we have to deal with so many parties. But then again, all these tests that have been administered in the past, they're doable as long as you stay organized and you know the law in the back of your head. So, without further ado, let's try to tackle question two from, I believe this is July 2015 bar exam. So here we go. Um, Oscar owned a fee simple absolute interest in Greenacre. He conveyed a fee simple defeasible interest in Greenacre to Martha and Lenny as joint tenants with a right of survivorship for so long as neither Martha nor Lenny make any transfer of Greenacre. In the event of such a transfer, Greenacre shall automatically revert back to Oscar. Subsequently, without Lenny's knowledge, Martha conveyed all of her interest in Greenacre to Paul. She died shortly afterwards. Unaware of Paul's existence, Lenny paid the property taxes. Paul entered into a written lease of his interest in Greenacre with Sally for a 2-year term at a rental of $500 per month. At the end of the lease, Sally stopped paying rent but continued to occupy Greenacre without Paul's consent. After 3 months, Paul confronted Sally. Although they did not agree to a new lease, Sally paid Paul the 3 months' rent she had not paid and resumed paying him monthly rent. Lenny then attempted to sell his interest in Greenacre. He soon learned that Sally was occupying Greenacre and that Paul had acquired Martha's interest. Concerned about conflicting property interest claims regarding Greenacre, Lenny commenced a lawsuit seeking to quiet title against Oscar, Martha's estate, Paul, and Sally, and to obtain from Paul an accounting and contribution for a share of the rent paid by Sally and for a share of the property taxes paid by Lenny. What property interest in Greenacre, if any, is the court likely to find possessed by Oscar, Lenny, Paul, Sally, and Martha's estate? Discuss. Number two, is Lenny likely to obtain an accounting and contribution from Paul? Discuss. Okay, so right off the bat, you see a lot of names. And what I would do in this case, for me at least, I would just write out the names that we have to discuss. So let's do that first. So we have Oscar, we have Lenny, we have Paul, we have Sally, and we have Martha. All right, so obviously we're gonna have to start with Oscar, right? So what happened to Oscar? Oscar owned a fee simple absolute interest. Okay. Fee simple absolute. And conveyed a fee simple defeasible interest in Greenacre to Martha and Lenny as joint tenants with a right of survivorship For so long as neither Martha nor Lenny make any transfer of Greenacre in the event of such a transfer. Okay, so what is a fee simple absolute? Fee simple absolute is the highest ownership in land, right? Now, since this is a freehold estate, if the possessory interest cut short from the prior possessor upon occurrence of an event, this would be considered a fee simple defeasible. And I kind of discussed this in my last video. I think it could have been easier if I had like a whiteboard to explain, but I tried my best to explain different types of fees. I try to explain fee simple absolute, fee tail, which goes by lineage or blood. I try to talk about life estate. I also talked a little bit about things like possibility of reverter and reversion. What happens to the transferor's possessory interest? I talked a little bit about what happens to the transferee's possessory interest, which can get pretty confusing because there's so many things that you have to work with. But for the purposes of this particular fact pattern, since fee simple absolute is the highest form of ownership, and I stated that right off the bat, and I also mentioned that this is a freehold estate, meaning for leases where possessory interest, you don't own it. There's no ownership interest. That would be a non-freehold estate. But since this is a fee simple, which is the highest ownership in land, this would be considered freehold estate. Again, if the possessory interest gets cut short from the prior possessor upon occurrence of an event, then that would be considered a fee simple defeasible, right? Um, if the defeasible fee it deals with duration, this would be called fee simple determinable, right? By duration, usually contains words such as long as, during, or any other words which would connote that the possessory interest would be cut short by durational language, right? Here, Oscar conveyed a fee simple defeasible interest in Greenacre to Martha. I'm just rehashing the facts again. any S-joint tenants with a right of survivorship for so long as, right? Since so long as is a durational language, this would be a fee simple determinable. I think I did okay trying to explain it. Um, Now, the next thing I will talk about is possibility of reverter. And I would probably separate this just so that it's easier to understand. Wait, oh, oops. Okay, so what is possibility of reverter? Possibility of reverter means that the possessory interest goes back to the transferor if the event stated in the durational language of fee simple determinable gets triggered. Unlike um, reversion, the transferor would not have to take any actions in order to get the property back. Rather, it goes back to the transferor automatically. Okay. However, if the language of the conveyance is subject to um, restraints against alienation, the portion of the language that has restraint against alienation would be thrown out. Okay, restraint against alienation. Normally, courts are reluctant to enforce contracts that forbid alienation or transferability Yeah, so normally courts are reluctant to enforce contracts that forbid alienation or transferability. Exceptions to this would be if the restraint against alienation is for a limited time, or conditional upon, let's just say, limited time. In this case, the language said Greenacre would belong to Martha and Lenny as joint tenants as long as they do not make any transfer of Greenacre. Since the word any is not for a limited duration, but a strict language that blocks the transferees from conveying Greenacre, this would be against the rule of alienation and would be thrown out, right? If this language is thrown out, that means that Greenacre reverting back automatically to Oscar would not be enforceable. Thus, Martha and Lenny would have would have interest in Greenacre as joint tenants, no matter what, since the language of Greenacre reverting back to Oscar would not be enforceable. So, Oscar, in this case, what happens? Oscar would not get Greenacre back because of the language he used, which was a restraint, a violation of restraint against alienation. Therefore, Oscar would not have any property interest in this case. All right, so we dealt with Oscar, talked about fee simple absolute, fee simple defeasible, possibility of reverter, restraint against alienation, but because the wording that was limiting their ability to transfer land, since that is thrown out, Oscar, who was supposed to have uh, the possibility of reverter if Martha and Lenny conveyed their property to anybody else, since that is struck out, what we would have is that Lenny and Martha would be joint tenants of Greenacre, but there would not be a possibility of reverter, which means that Oscar would not get the property back, even if Martha and Lenny ends up conveying Greenacre to another party. Okay, so I think that's okay for Oscar. Now, what are we dealing with now? We're dealing with Lenny. So let's look at the facts quickly one more time. All right, so we have here um, without Lenny's knowledge, Martha conveyed all of her interest in Greenacre to Paul, and she died shortly afterwards. Unaware of Paul's existence, Lenny paid the property taxes. And then you go to paragraph 4. Lenny then attempted to sell his interest in Greenacre, but he soon learned that Sally was occupying Greenacre and that Paul had acquired Martha's interest. Okay. And then there's a small section in number 2 that wants to know, is Lenny likely to obtain accounting and contribution from Paul? But we're not dealing with that. The main thing, in my opinion, here is a issue of joint tenancy, right? Because here in the first paragraph it says, Oscar conveyed Greenacre to Martha and Lenny as joint tenants with a right of survivorship, right? So I think we're trying to figure out whether he does have a joint tenant interest, which means 50% with a right of survivorship. Does he have that? And we have to kind of go into whether, because for joint tenancy analysis, we're gonna have to do the four unities rule, which is, as long as you memorize it, it shouldn't be too bad. But if you don't, you're gonna have issues. So what happened here, right? Oscar conveyed Greenacre to Martha and Lenny with a right of survivorship. He also added the clause saying if Lenny or Martha convey Greenacre, it would revert back to Oscar. But since we already discussed that this portion of reverter would be against restraint against alienation and would not be enforceable, we have to now discuss whether Oscar's conveyance to Lenny and Martha as joint tenants was valid. All right? And then you go into joint tenancy analysis. So, what's required in a joint tenancy? So, joint tenancy requires two elements. First, it must have the four unities requirement: title, possession, interest. Is it time? I think. I think it's time. Second, the language of conveyance of joint tenancy must have the words with a right of survivorship, right? Okay. If by any chance the four unities requirements are not met, the effects of joint tenancy would become tenancy in common. I think I should just end with that. Okay. Feel like maybe I'm possession, interest, title, time. There's so many subjects that you have to memorize, so sometimes I blank out. But if this was the real test, I wouldn't worry about it because I know that possession interest is right. All right, let's just try to analyze. So, so in a joint tenancy agreement, the title has to be signed in a same instrument. I could have worded that better. But oh well, let's just analyze. So, in Oscar's conveyance to Martha and Lenny as joint tenants, there seemed to be just one instrument that conveyed Greenacre to Lenny and Martha as joint tenants. So title requirement is met. Okay. Possession. There doesn't seem to be a possessory issue here, as each joint tenant, Martha and Lenny, did not ouster anyone. also seem to have had 100% possession of Greenacre individually. Um, so here, what happened was that Martha conveyed all of her interest in Greenacre to Paul, right? So this element is met. Without Lenny's knowledge, Martha conveyed all of her interest in Greenacre to Paul. Um, Now, this is something that I probably need more practice, but at this point, what are we gonna talk about? So possession, they each had possession of Greenacre. Title was with the same instrument. Without Lenny's knowledge, Martha conveyed all of her interest in Greenacre to Paul. At this point, since Martha conveyed all of her interest, the unity interest was broken. I probably should say that in another way, but can't really think of that right now. So when this happens, interest that is required for joint tenancy was not met. All right. So time. In the beginning, um, Oscar conveying Greenacre to Martha, and Lenny happened at the same time. But since Martha conveyed her interest to Paul, this time requirement was not met since she did not is not this time requirement would not be satisfied. Let's just say that. Okay, so though Lenny and Martha were joint tenants of Green Acre with four unities requirements met in the beginning when Martha conveyed her interest to Paul, both time and interest requirement for joint tenancy was not satisfied. If this happens, Lenny would still have 50% interest in Green Acre, but not as joint tenants, but rather as tenancy in common. This means that in if either Martha or Lenny died, if the possessory interest was joint tenancy, it would go to either joint tenants. But in a tenancy in common, the interest would not go to either person if one person dies, right? Because the special thing about joint tenancy is the fact that there is a right of survivorship. But if there is a tenancy in common, then there wouldn't be a right of survivorship. If one person dies, the other person wouldn't automatically get the portion of Greenacre, which belonged to the other joint tenant. But in a tenancy in common, it would probably go to heirs or whatever that person willed or whatnot. So Lenny would still have 50% interest as a joint, not a joint tenant, but as a tenant in tenancy in common. All right. So Sally is interesting. So Sally so Paul entered into a written lease of his interest in Green Acre with Sally for a 2-year term. If Paul was a joint tenant, had a joint tenancy with Lenny, he would have needed consent by Lenny in order for Paul to lease his interest to a third party. However, this was not necessary because, as discussed discussed above, the joint tenancy for unity's requirement was broken when Martha conveyed her interest to Paul. So Paul was free to do anything he wanted to do, such as lease his interest to another person. Okay, so Sally had a 2-year term at a rental of 500 a month. Since 2-year was a fixed term, this would be a tenancy for years. If the terms continued at intervals and the rent was paid on intervals, this would be considered periodic tenancy. Also, if the lessee violated the terms of the lease and stayed over the agreement, this would be a tenancy at sufferance, right? First, this was a tenancy for years as discussed. Second, after 3 months, no, at the end of the lease, Sally stopped paying rent, but continued to occupy Green Acre without Paul's consent. At this point, Sally's lease had become a tenancy at sufferance. After Paul confronted Sally, and although they did not agree to a new lease, Sally paid Paul the 3 months' rent and resumed paying him month. So this lease started out as tenancy for years for a fixed term. When Sally stayed became a holdover tenant, she she had a tenancy for sufferance. However, since Sally ended up paying rent, and resumed, and Paul did not object. This likely became a lease for peri tenancy for a period. All right, that was kind of tough, but so Sally had a valid periodic tenancy with Paul, or a non freehold interest in Greenacre. All right, we don't have that much time because it's been 46 minutes, so we have to try to finish this in 14 minutes, which is not going to be easy. And I don't think this is going to be like a 75 or an 80 answer, but I think it could pass. I don't think it's a 65. I think it's a 70. You may disagree, but you know, I feel like this is a passing score, and I don't need a 85. I just need a 70, 65 maybe to pass. So that's all I want. All right, so maybe we could have done a better job with Sally, but oh well. So we did Oscar, just making sure. We did Lenny. So I guess what we missed was Paul. Darn. Um, so what we're gonna do here is replace Sally with Paul. Sally. All right. Let's just not an easy essay. So what did Paul have? Paul had a 50% interest in Greenacre as tenancy in common with Lenny. And then we can talk about Sally. Okay. And then Martha. Um, as mentioned in the facts, Martha conveyed all of her interest in Greenacre to Paul. Um, I think I said earlier that for joint tenants, when you sell property to a third party, you need consent. But I'm gonna have to double check. And I don't really know what I'm going to write about Martha. So Martha conveyed all of her interest in Greenacre to Paul. Oh well, I'm just going to write. So she does not have any interest left over in Greenacre. Well, this is not the best, but again, I think it's a passing essay, so I'm just going to continue. Can Lenny obtain an accounting and contribution from Paul? So, between tenants, holders of tenancy in common, um, one holder cannot claim improvements made to the property. However, any necessary repairs or taxes can be claimed, can be um, to be paid by um, moreover, since each tenant in common have possessory interest, they do not have to pay the other holder of tenant in common for their own stay. However, they must share the profits from third parties. All right, here, Lenny paid the property taxes. Since each tenant in common is responsible for maintenance, Paul Lenny would be able to get accounting and contributions from Paul for the taxes he paid. Also, any profits from third parties must be shared with other tenants in common. Here, Sally entered into a lease agreement with Paul since she was a third party and the profits came from her. Lenny, I mean Paul, would have to share the profits from third party, aka what's her name? Sally. All right, so that was not the best answer, but I got it done. Um, Not a short answer either, but that was like really a test situation. Um, it's been like 55 minutes, so I've completed this essay. I could have done it better, but because of time constraints, because I'm trying to share what I'm doing, um, I wasn't able to perform at my best. But let me say this again, I don't think this is like a 75, but I am very sure that it's at least a 65 to a 70 answer. And, I'm not trying to get a perfect score on the bar exam. All I want is for me to pass. So that's it for question two for the July 2015 bar exam. And I hope that you can benefit from watching someone else write this out. If you can do it better, that's even better. I want you to do better than me. But if there are points that you haven't thought about, and I kind of talked about it or I wrote it, that means that you're gonna get a ton of value from this video. So I hope this was very helpful to you, and I'll see you guys in the next video.